Hello and welcome. My name is Walter McGrory and welcome to Call of the Runes. Today we're going to talk about the first letter of the second ayat, Hagalaz, or the letter H. This rune literally means hail, and more metaphysically it represents a destructive power. Hail is a very destructive element. Even now, cars, roofs can get severely damaged by hailstones. But hail was even more destructive in the time before we had sturdy houses like we have now. Whole crops could be flattened, and without access to food from further away regions, that could mean that whole villages were severely in trouble for food in the winter. It is a rune in readings that could represent cold and winter and destruction. And above all, it is a rune of sudden dramatic change. And with that, let us begin. We're beginning with the rune poems, and I'm starting with the Norwegian rune poems, as always. Hail is the coldest of grain. Christ created the world of old. Cold grain, or ice grain, or ice egg, these are all kennings for hail, and they're commonly used in stories and in poetry. The egg, the seed, or the grain, these are all symbols of emergent life and potentially symbols of creation, and therefore it fits with the sentence, Christ created the world of old. It might be weird to see talk of Jesus in a Norwegian rune poem, and it's especially weird because even within Christian mythology, it is the Father and not Christ who is responsible for the creation of the world and the universe and the waters and everything. It is therefore possible that this rune poem has been changed slightly, has been Christianized after the fact. And one of the potential things that could have changed is that the Krister that is now in the rune poem could have been Kjallar, or one of Odin's many names. It would be a good fit, and Kjallar's literal meaning is the nurser, which then again fits with the theme of grain and creation. These are all possible, especially since in Norse mythology the theme of destructive ice fits very well with the creation of the world, because the world originally is created from both fire and from ice, as we remember from the rune Urus, as we talked about extensively then. It makes it seem a little bit like Hagalaz is a rune of creation. It's a positive rune, it's a rune that makes things grow. In other rune poems that we'll get to a little bit later, and in runic amulets found containing Hagalaz, Hagalaz is usually shown as a much more destructive force, something that destroys, not something that creates. And because of that, I feel that it's logical to interpret the Norwegian rune poem in the same way, Hagalaz as a destructive force. If an apple tree is born from a single apple seed, then a frozen field can grow from an ice seed. The world was created from frost and fire, but in those barren lands, nobody can survive, or at least no mortal. In that sense, Hagalaz is a harbinger of death. The Icelandic rune poem echoes that sentiment a little bit. Hail is cold grain. That is similar to the ice seeds that we saw in the Norwegian rune poem. And a shower of sleet and the sickness of serpents. No creation is mentioned in this rune poem, and even now, in our modern age, sleet is a big problem. So sleet is frozen rain that hits the roads and can bring all traffic, be it by train, plane or automobile, to a grinding halt. Sickness of serpents is not that the ice or the snow or the hail is a sickness to the serpents, so it's not the serpents per se that are being harmed here. But rather, sickness of serpents is a kenning, a descriptor for a snake's venom. We've also seen this before in the rune poems and the stories that I told surrounding the rune Urus, because the ice in Niflheim the realm of ice and snow, one of the two primordial realms, is described in the Eddas as being venomous. And that is not weird to see ice as a venom if you see how winter rolls into a Scandinavian country and how it kills all the plants, how everything that it touches dies, how even in humans, if you're exposed to the cold long enough, you get hypothermia, your extremities might turn dark and they might wither away. Very similarly to what you might expect if you are poisoned or bitten by a snake in a certain point. In Niflheim itself lives Nidhugr, and he lives there gnawing at the roots of the world tree, damaging the world tree, slowly destroying it. The word Nith, from the first part of his name, means dishonored. And at Ragnarok, it is this serpent that brings on his wings all the dishonored dead with him up to fight against the gods in Ragnarok. Because he's not alone there in Niflheim. This worst place to go after you've died is reserved for oathbreakers and for murderers. So it's not just the venom of the cold, it's not just the venom of the serpent, but it's the corruption that oathbringers and murderers can bring to the world. And it seems harsh to put murderers and oathbreakers in the same category, because murdering somebody seems harder than breaking an oath. But it's really dependent in communities where you are depending on each other constantly, how importantly it is seen that you can rely on your neighbors. If you can rely on your neighbors, you have a safe community. If you cannot rely on the word of your neighbor, that brings you, but also your entire community, in danger. So the word of a man is slightly more important in a time where the systems aren't as interconnected and as wide as they are in our time, where you have to rely on your neighbors for survival. And if someone in your community is an oathbreaker, keeps breaking his word, then can have disastrous consequences for the entirety of the community if he doesn't do his tasks, pick up his slack. The last rune poem is the Anglo-Saxon rune poem. Hail is the whitest of grain. It is whirled from the vault in the heaven, and it is tossed about by gusts of wind, and then it melts into water. The last of the three rune poems starts with a variation on the grain of ice. It is the whitest of grains. And it then goes on to describe the whirling pandemonium of a hailstorm. And that is how it feels when a hailstorm hits. Not only is it very loud, but it's also very painful to walk through. It is much more extreme weather than snow or rain on its own. It's much more of a chaotic feeling as the ice pellets pelt off and bounce off the surrounding objects. This can be interpreted as the pandemonium left in the wake of the destruction that Hagalaz represents as well. Laying waste to crops is not the only destruction that the hailstorm brings, because the destroyed crops can then lead to a winter of famine, and the reduced immunity from not eating enough food can in the end also lead to plague. So the destruction ripples out from the point of impact. The rune poem ends with a slightly more hopeful message. This is where the hail melts away into water. All things must pass in the end, even the raw destruction of Hagalaz. And that's maybe also one of the more characteristic things about this rune, that it strikes as a destructive force and then it dissipates again. It is not lingering, it does not stay. It is a moment of quick destruction, and afterwards the world is changed. We can see Hagalaz being used, or seemingly being used, for its destructive power in several amulets, or in several objects, I should say. For instance, DR 196U is a 5th century spear shaft and was found in Fyen in Denmark. On the spear shaft is an inscription, and the inscription doesn't end with just the Hagalaz rune, but with the word written out. And translated, the spear shaft says the following: I am called Earl Muha. On Zugal, I cry, I roar resoundingly, I invoke hail into the spear. The construction of this charm, and it's translated now into English, but is formulaic. The second line uses alliteration and mirrors the third line. And in this is also, this the third line, the statement of intent is given. It says what this charm is meant to do. So first we start with some alliteration, and then we get a mirroring sentence in which the statement of intent is given. These last two lines then also have the same formulaic structure, roughly, as the Galdr verse. Galdr is a form of chanted magic, which is a specific verse line. Galdra, at least, is. And we'll get to that in a later video, how Galdr exactly works. But it's a formulaic way of phrasing things to make them come true, or at least to announce to the reader that magic is being used. We also see that the wielder of the spear calls upon himself in the writing here, or at least the person who made the spear. This could also be true, but he's calling upon his own power to invoke the hail. He's using his own magic or his own force of personality to make his statement become true. Also on the shaft are several bind runes, and we'll talk about bind runes a little bit later as well. Bind runes may or may not have been used to enhance the magical effect, or, and this is slightly more likely, the bind runes were used because of the limited space available on the spear shaft, and because there's only a limited amount of room available, they put some runes together to get their whole message on. Core of this amulet, at least, is invoking hail into the striking object, invoking the destruction into the spear. Conversely, we see a second example of Hagalaz being used in a war implement, and in this case it's a Thorsberg shield buckle. The inscription was made this time on the backside of the shield buckle, so the part that's attached to the wood. It's not visible to the naked eye, so it's not decorative, but it is magical or personally religiously important. It bears the following short inscription: Challenger of, and then just a Hagalaz rune, or a defender against the Hagalaz rune. It seems in this way that spears and arrows were magically or symbolically or religiously, in a way at least, linked to the concept of Hagalaz, and that this shield was invoking a protection against that destructive force, against those strikes from the sky. He challenges with his shield Hagalaz. He challenges with his shield the destruction. Culturally, maybe the most interesting thing to look at first is Volspala 19, and that goes as follows. An ash tree I know, and Yggdrasil is its name. With waters white is the great tree wet, and thence comes the dew that falls into the dales, green by earth's well. And so does everything grow. This story echoes the Anglo-Saxon rune poem. First there is the hail, the water white, and then that melts away and growth begins. We see green talked about, and at the foot of the tree live the three Norns, the fate spirits that in Norse mythology weave destiny. There's a theme that we also see in Greek mythology, where it's the Grea who weave this destiny. In Norse mythology, it's the Norns. These three Norns are not the only three fate spirits, they're not even the only three Norns, but they are the most commonly named, and they represent the past, the present, and the future. One of the three sisters, Ud specifically, represents the past, and her well is then, in this case, nourished by the past's melting hail, representing the good times that come after the hard times. In conclusion, in Hagalaz is the rapid strike of a hailstorm. And if you've ever been in a severe rainstorm, you know it can strike without warning, and it can shatter glass and even rip branches from trees and flatten crops. And then it might last only for 5 minutes and disappear as fast as it came there, leaving a clear sky behind. And the only evidence that it was ever there was the destruction and a slight dampness on the ground. I find it helpful to relate to the runes with personal experience. And so I find it good to, if you are studying the rune Hagalaz, to reflect on how fragile or balanced sometimes is, how quickly sometimes it can change, and how in a moment an entire life can shift, even though it seems sometimes that we have everything nicely in order and everything is nicely checked and balanced. And then look at what moments in our life align with Hagalaz, if there are any moments as such that ever happened. And maybe for you that has never happened, and that is always nice, but for many people that has happened. In readings, this is then also never or rarely at least, a fortunate rune to draw. If the reading then notes always at least a time of change, not one born out of wish or out of conscious effort, but a change that is born out of a sudden outside influence, a strong change that is brought about by something that you cannot control. The change will be sudden and probably unfavorable, depending on what runes it is connected with. For instance, if we connect Hagalaz with the rune Veil, the wealth rune, that might indicate sudden financial problems. Hagalaz paired with Tewas, the justice rune, might suggest sudden legal difficulties that you have not seen coming. More positively, if you would draw or use Hagalaz together with Algis, the protection rune, it can show you that you can weather this storm unscathed, and come out on the other side. This was my interpretation of Hagalaz. If in the comments you have any thoughts about Hagalaz yourself, or you have any other interpretations, then please let me know. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and it would also really help if you share these videos on your own social media platforms. If you would like to know more, all the information I just talked about, plus much more, is available in the book, The Call of the Runes, and the book is available on Amazon, and you can find a link in the description of this video. I hope to see you next week when we're talking about Naudus, and that is inevitable.